Hello and welcome to this installment of the Chinese Business History webinar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. My name is Ghassan Moazin and I'm an assistant professor here at the Institute. So today, for the last session of this semester, we're very happy and honored to welcome back to the Chinese Business History webinar Dr. Koji Hirata, who will be talking about his new book that just came out yesterday, actually, according to Hong Kong time. So in the US, it's still the publication day. Yes, exactly. That just came out, basically, with Cambridge University Press. I think most of you will know Dr. Hirata. He is a senior lecturer and senior research fellow in history at Monash University. He received his PhD from Stanford, spent some time as a junior research fellow in Cambridge then, and yeah, as I said, is now at Monash and has obviously published very widely on the histories of modern China, Japan, and industrialization more broadly. And as I said, he will be talking about his new book today. The book is titled Making Mao's Steelworks, Industrial Manchuria and the Transnational Origins of Chinese Socialism, and is out with Cambridge University Press. Before I hand things over to Dr. Hirata, the format is as usual. Dr. Hirata is going to talk for around 35-40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. If you have any questions for Dr. Hirata, please submit them to the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I will read them out for Dr. Hirata for you to get back to you about. But I don't want to take up any more time. So Koji, if you're ready, please feel free to get started.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you all for joining this talk. And also thank you so much, Ghassan and John, for inviting me to this very special occasion. And as Ghassan mentioned today, so the book has just come out. So I mean, the official publication date is like the 5th of December in US time. So I insist, we are still on the official birthday of the book. So anyway, so the book discusses an important chapter of modern Chinese history, the evolution of heavy industry in northeast China, also known as Manchuria or Dongbei. And in particular, my book focuses on one major steel enterprise, Anshan Iron and Steel Works, or Anshan Gantie Gongsi, which is commonly known as Angan. And Angan is located in the city of Anshan, in the southern part of northeast China. And by telling the local story of Angan, the book illustrates industrial Manchuria's role in modern China and modern China's place in the modern world. And it's a story that reveals the complexities of socialist industrialization in China before, during, and after the era of Chairman Mao, spanning different regimes and international influences. Now, imagine yourself back in the early 1950s, and the world is emerging from the shadow of World War II. The Cold War is intensifying, and in China, Mao Zedong's newly established People's Republic is beginning to make efforts to transform a largely agrarian nation into an industrial powerhouse. And at the heart of this effort is the concept of socialist industrialization, or 社会主义工业化, which China learned from the Soviet Union. And the engine of socialist industrialization was state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, companies owned and managed by the government, rather than privately owned firms. And another hallmark of socialist industrialization was the focus on heavy industries, so capital-intensive sectors that typically make producers goods such as steel, locomotives, or machine tools. And there was perhaps no better symbol of this than Angan. And Angan was by far the largest Chinese enterprise in steel making, and which was often regarded as the most important industrial sector for socialist industrialization. And at that time, producing about half of China's steel, Angan was the fourth largest steel producer in Asia, following Kuznetsk in Siberia, Tata in India, and Yahata in Japan. And furthermore, Angan was among China's largest SOEs. And today, through museums, essays, films, and TV series, Angan symbolizes a golden age of northeastern industry, when the region was at the forefront of China's steelmaking, auto manufacturing, coal mining, and other industries vital for building socialism. And the history of Angan and industrial Manchuria is portrayed as a tale of the Chinese Communist Party's nation-building efforts. However, such a narrative, solely emphasizing the Communist Party's leadership, deliberately downplays certain aspects of Angan's and Manchuria's history. And one such aspect, only briefly mentioned in Angan's official historical account today, is the Soviet Union's involvement in its expansion during the 1950s. And even more problematic than the Soviet assistance is the role of Imperial Japan and nationalist China in the history of Angan and industrial Manchuria. And despite its status as a model socialist enterprise in Mao's China, Angan's story actually begins well before the Communist Revolution. And many SOEs in northeast China, including Angan, originated as Japanese colonial enterprises, particularly under the Japanese-sponsored regime of Manchukuo. And after World War II, the Soviet Union briefly occupied Manchuria. And between 1946 and 1948, China's nationalist government took over Angan and other formerly Japanese enterprises in Manchuria and restructured them as Chinese SOEs. And it was in 1948 that the Communist Party assumed control of Manchuria, including Angan. The book tells the story of transnational influences, of Japanese colonial ambitions, nationalist Chinese efforts, and Soviet visions, and finally, the Chinese Communist Party's transformation of these foundations into what became the backbone of Maoist China's industrial power. And Angan's story is a microcosm of the modern history of China in general and Manchuria in particular, a story of change and continuity at the interplay between global and local forces. And the main argument of the book is that socialist industrialization in China and elsewhere was part of a broader global history of late industrialization that encompassed both capitalist and socialist worlds. And this connects to three more specific arguments. Manchuria as a transnational borderland played a crucial role in the making of China's socialist industrialization. And technology transfers and the geopolitics were entangled in late industrialization. And the process of industrialization under socialism involved constant contention among various organizations and individuals, both within and outside state authority. And the book is based on archives and interviews in multiple countries. Unfortunately, Chinese archives, especially those in the Northeast, have increasingly become closed over the past decade or so. And that is why my research draws heavily upon primary sources that I discovered outside of China, and especially in archives in Taiwan, Japan, and the United States and Russia. And if you are interested in knowing more about my primary sources, I'd be happy to discuss them during the Q&A session. And for the rest of the talk, I will give a brief overview of the key questions addressed in my book. First, a global history of late industrialization. And contrary to the widely held notion that socialist industrialization fundamentally differed from capitalist industrialization, my book argues that socialist industrialization in China and elsewhere was, in fact, part of a larger global history of late industrialization that encompassed both capitalist and socialist worlds. And compared to early industrializers like Britain or the United States, late industrializers such as Prussia, Tsarist Russia, and even early Meiji Japan relied heavily on state intervention to catch up with the early industrializers. And the global history of late industrialization entered a new phase in the 20th century, particularly after World War I, with the rise of the Soviet Union. And despite their revolutionary ideology, the early Soviet Union's industrialization policy was deeply influenced by wartime economic mobilization in Western Europe and Tsarist Russia. And during the interwar period, the Soviet Union's rapid catch-up industrialization impressed many in East Asia. And Japanese economic policies in Manchukuo, particularly the 5-year plan for heavy industrialization, somewhat emulated the Soviet planned economy. And simultaneously, nationalist China's wartime economy also drew partial inspiration from the Soviet Union. And in the post-war world, the Soviet Union's state-directed industrialization served as a model for many late industrializing countries, both socialist and capitalist. And consequently, the Soviet-inspired economic policies by the Japanese and the nationalist regimes in Manchuria set a precedent for the PRC's socialist industrialization modeled after the Soviet Union. And Angan's development was part of this broader history of late industrialization. And the history of late industrialization in transnational Manchuria provides a fresh perspective on change and continuity in modern China, incorporating both regional and global dimensions into the discussion. And many recent historical works on the early PRC challenge the conventional understanding of the 1949 revolution as a historical watershed. In the sphere of industry, scholars have identified various connections and similarities between the early PRC's planned economy and the nationalist China's economic policy. And building on their insights, I argue that to study change and continuity in 20th century China, we need to consider both the diverse regional historical trajectories within China and their interactions with global influences. And while Angan is often seen as a shining example of Maoist China's socialist planned economy, its roots go back to Japan's imperial era. In 1916, Japan established iron mines and factories in Anshan as part of its larger strategy to expand its informal empire in Manchuria. And after Japan militarily occupied the entirety of Manchuria in 1931, the Japanese colonial project involved significant investments in industry in the region. And they viewed Manchuria as a resource-rich region that could support their broader imperial ambitions in Asia. And the establishment of a major steelworks, Showa steelworks in Anshan was a key component of this vision. And together with several other Japanese-built factories, Showa steelworks laid the groundwork for what would later become Angan. And following the end of World War II, the landscape shifted again. The Soviet Union briefly occupied Manchuria in late 1945 and early 1946, taking control of Japanese-built factories in Anshan and other parts of the region. And they dismantled some of the region's industrial equipment for use in the post-war reconstruction of the Soviet economy. And after the Soviet withdrawal in the spring of 1946, the Chinese nationalist government took over and restructured these enterprises into state-owned enterprises. In Anshan, the nationalists confiscated several Japanese factories, including the Showa Steelworks, and merged them into a single large SOE, which they named Angan. So the name Angan, which we use today, was actually created by the nationalist government in 1946. And it was in 1948 that the Chinese Communist Party finally gained control of Manchuria and began transforming Angan into the the centerpiece of its industrial vision. And after the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, Manchuria emerged as the epicenter of the nation's socialist industrialization. The Communist Party followed the Stalinist model of development. The focus was on building up heavy industries like steel, coal, and machinery, sectors seen as essential for developing a strong, self-reliant nation. And Manchuria, with its existing infrastructure from the Japanese colonial era, was perfectly positioned to become the epicenter of this effort. And the initial phase of the CCP's reconstruction of industrial Manchuria relied on the expertise of Japanese engineers, scientists, and the skilled workers who remained in Manchuria. And the picture here shows Japanese engineers in Angan in 1953. And in the early People's Republic, Angan was a symbol of the Communist Party's developmental ambition. For instance, in 1954, Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, visited Angan and was impressed by it. And with Soviet technical assistance, the Chinese government reconstructed and further expanded Angan, making it one of the largest steel producers in Asia by the mid-1950s. During the 1950s, Manchuria produced 30 to 40% of China's heavy industrial products, and this included a significant portion of the nation's steel and coal, resources vital to the growth of other industries. And Manchuria's economy was largely built around state-owned heavy industries. And this contrasted sharply with Maoist China's other industrial heartland, Shanghai, whose economy was largely driven by privately owned light industries. And this difference would shape the fate of these regions for decades to come. And these regional differences were evident in the administrative system of the government. Between 1949 and 1954, the new regime divided the entire country into 6 regionally defined greater administrative regions, or Dashinchenchu. And even after these larger administrative regions were officially abolished in 1954, government statistics and other documents often continued to use them for convenience. The key region in the formation of the SOE system in the PRC was Manchuria. And in the first decade of the PRC, Manchuria boasted the highest concentration of SOEs, contributing around 30% of the industrial output across all Chinese SOEs. And this contrasted sharply with coastal cities in China proper, such as Shanghai and Tianjin. And Manchurian SOEs such as Angan served as a national model during the formative years of the PRC's SOE system. So China's economic Stalinization also began in Manchuria, where the regional communist leader Gao Gan started collaborating with Soviet advisors to reconstruct Angan and other enterprises during the Chinese Civil War. After the PRC's founding, Manchuria continued to be the main site for Sino-Soviet economic cooperation, as evidenced by Angan's expansion with Soviet technologies during the 1950s. So the history of Angan reveals that Manchuria as a transnational borderland played a crucial role in shaping China's socialist industrialization. Angan and industrial Manchuria evolved through the influences of multiple regimes, each leaving its mark and contributing to the hybrid system. In the region, state-directed heavy industrialization commenced well before the Communist Revolution under the Japanese and the nationalist regimes. And Angan's transnational development over the 20th century also illustrates how technology transfers and geopolitics were linked with each other. As scholars like Alice Armstrong and Stefan Link have demonstrated, technology transfers constituted a vital aspect of late industrialization. To achieve economic independence, late industrializers needed to import cutting-edge technologies from more advanced industrial powers, at least during the initial stages. And importing technologies from advanced industrial nations represented a challenge to the global division of labor, where North America and Western Europe specialized in industry and the rest of the world in agriculture. And late industrialization in Manchuria and China highlights the complex connections between technology transfers and the geopolitics. And in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, significant investment decisions were made by the Japanese army stationed there, which was also a major consumer of the iron and steel goods produced in Anshan. And heavy industries in Manchukuo brought in advanced technologies and management practices, mainly from Japan's wartime ally, Nazi Germany. And geopolitical concerns continued to influence policymaking and technology transfers after the founding of the PRC. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953 shaped early Cold War geopolitics, with the Soviet Union as China's primary ally against the United States. And this made it inevitable for the PRC to seek cooperation with the Soviet Union for heavy industrialization. In the 1950s, the Sino-Soviet partnership brought in Soviet technology, expertise, and know-how to help build up China's heavy industry through machines, designs, works, and advisors sent from the Soviet Union. And Angan, in particular, benefited from this cooperation. And Soviet advisors worked closely with Chinese engineers and managers, transferring knowledge and helping to implement Soviet-style production techniques. However, this partnership was not without challenges, and the relationship between China and the Soviet Union would eventually deteriorate, leading to significant shifts in China's approach to innovation. So, the history of Angan and Manchuria shows that national security concerns can strongly dictate the forms of technology transfer that late industrializers choose. And so some social scientists have noted that state-owned enterprises under state socialism operated primarily through vertical bargaining within the state bureaucracy. And this contrasted sharply with the horizontal bargaining between sellers and buyers in market economies. However, the case of Angan reveals a more complex picture. In Maoist China, local governments played a considerable role, and the Chinese SOEs had to grapple with both vertical and horizontal bureaucratic bargaining. And major SOEs like Angan were subject to the vertical command of national-level industrial ministries, such as the Ministry of Metallurgical Industry. At the same time, they were also under the horizontal influence of local authorities, such as the CCP provincial and the city committees. And this created an environment where factory directors primarily followed vertical command from Beijing, while party secretaries facilitated horizontal control from the local CCP committees. Although the dual structure of state and the party originated in the Soviet Union, implementing this framework in China resulted in a more localized SOE system. In the early 1950s, some PRC leaders tried to promote a Soviet-style top-down management with SOEs falling under centralized vertical command line from industrial ministries in Beijing down to factory directors. However, this system was abandoned in 1956, which allowed local CCP committees to interfere in SOE affairs. And the local officials further expanded their influence during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And the decentralization of SOE was most dramatically exemplified by Angan's organizational amalgamation with the Anshan City Committee government during the Cultural Revolution. And these divisions within the party-state authority significantly affected the relationship between SOEs and their workers. And notably, local party committees often mobilized workers ideologically to challenge SOE managers, reinforcing the city government's horizontal control and weakening Beijing's vertical influence. And the CCP provided ideological and organizational guidelines for propaganda and social engineering, aiming to cultivate a new generation of socialist workers devoted to their motherland's industrialization. And through daily study sessions, mass mobilization campaigns, and other forms of political propaganda, local CCP cadres tried to mold SOE workers into a workforce dedicated to their workplace and the party state. And given the primary role in ideologically educating SOE workers, local Communist Party officials often used mass mobilization campaigns to strengthen their influence over SOEs. The most notable example was the so-called Angan Constitution or Angan Shenhua. And this was a report written by the Communist Party Anshan City Committee in 1960 during the Great Leap Forward. The Anshan City Committee wrote this report to consolidate their control over Angan through a mass mobilization campaign rooted in Maoist ideology. And Chairman Mao read and liked this report and named it Angan Constitution. However, the Communist Party's attempt to politically educate an SOE workforce also empowered workers to reinterpret the official political discourse to challenge CCP authorities itself. For example, during the Funded Forward campaign in 1957, Angan engineers repurposed the political language of socialism to criticize Angan authorities for perceived injustices. So, while the Chinese Communist Party set the ideological and institutional framework for industrialization, the day-to-day operation of state-owned enterprises like Angan were heavily influenced by the actions of lower-ranking officials and workers on the ground. And these individuals were not passive recipients of state policies. Instead, they actively interpreted and at times reinterpreted the rule of the game set by the party state to suit their own interests. And this bottom-up involvement often led to tensions within the bureaucratic system. As we move forward in time, the story of Angan and Manchuria takes another turn. After Mao's death in 1976, China began to shifting away from a centrally planned economy toward market-oriented reforms under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. And this transition marked a significant departure from the heavy industry-focused strategy of the Mao years. The focus turned towards light industry and consumer goods and export-oriented growth, a shift that benefited coastal cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen. For Northeast China, this shift was challenging. The region's economy had been built around heavy industry and state-owned enterprises. By the 1990s, the Northeast had become China's Rust Belt, characterized by aging factories and economic stagnation. Angan, once the pride of Chinese industrialization, faced significant difficulties in this new era. The decline of Manchuria's heavy industry was not just an economic issue, it was also a social one. State-owned enterprises that had once provided stability and a sense of community were now struggling to survive, and workers who had spent their entire lives at Angan found themselves facing layoffs and uncertainty. And the social safety net provided by the SOEs began to diminish, leading to widespread discontent. The transition from a planned economy to a market economy was far from smooth, and the people of Northeast China bore the burden of these changes. And to some extent, the social identity and the political culture of SOE workers that had been formed during the Mao era continue to influence how the people of Angan and industrial Manchuria understood their experience. And leaders of workers staged protests against SOEs and local government by co-opting the socialist state discourse. For instance, in demanding jobs, and Anshan workers sang the International in public. And the nostalgia for the Mao era SOEs became a common theme of TV series, novels, and online short stories about the Northeast Rust Belt. The challenges faced by Angan in adapting to new economic realities are emblematic of the struggles faced by many state-owned enterprises across industrial Manchuria. And these are the main themes discussed in my book. And in conclusion, let me show you the table of contents to explain how the book addresses these questions both chronologically and thematically. While covering the entire 20th century, the book provides a more detailed account of the years 1948 until 1957, so the first decade of CCP rule in Manchuria. And this structure allows me to focus on the formative years of China's socialist industrialization while embedding that pivotal decade within a longer history of late industrialization in China and beyond. And part one has two chronological chapters on the pre-CC communist period, and part two includes four thematic chapters, each examining the early PRC's socialist industrialization from 1948 until 1957. And part three returns to a chronological structure with two chapters covering the period from 1957 to 2000. And this book traces the genesis, evolution, and legacy of socialist industrialization at Eurasia's geopolitical crossroads by chronicling the history of a single industrial site from the bottom all the way to the top. It illustrates how national policies and international relations intersected with enterprise behaviors, local politics, and people's everyday lives. Now, here is an important spoiler. Chairman Mao never actually visited Anshan in his lifetime. Nevertheless, I insist that Angan was Mao's fieldworks. Even though he never visited it in person, the chairman thought and wrote much about Angan because it was central to his vision of socialist industrialization. A cross-examination of the party state's policies towards Angan and its ground-level consequences helps us understand the realities of Mao's industrial vision. And the book explores that vision by telling the stories of Chinese, Japanese, and Soviet people in the offices, factories, mines, and the streets of Anshan. And if you are interested in their stories, please do consider reading my book. And thank you. And if you have any questions, now I'll be happy to discuss them further.
Yeah, Koji, thank you very much for giving us this great overview of your book. And yes, I think we should all, of course, try to get a copy and read it as soon as possible. I'm sure we are all, very interested in it now, if we hadn't already been.
Also, the paperback version is already available.
That's very good, yeah.
Yep.
So that's actually an portable version. But as I said at the beginning, we have now some time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions for Koji or for Dr. Hirata, then please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I will read them out for everyone. To talk a bit more about the primary source and how you actually got hold of the primary source that you use in the book, and what difficulties you might have also faced. You mentioned you would be happy to talk a bit more about that. So I think that would be very interesting for all of us, particularly for people trying to do research on post-49 China now. I think that would be very interesting if you could share a bit more.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's a very yeah, important thing to talk about, especially with like scholars younger than us, because they are now, beginning their dissertation research. So the thing is, as I said, there was some difficulty in finding primary sources, which I discussed in an appendix to my book. So there's a note on primary sources at the end of the book. So the thing is that, so the book was obviously published, we are now in 2024, and it's a book with a copyright in 2024. However, most of the archival research for this book was done in the 2010s. And now when I was doing the final editing of the book, I did feel that these primary source bases are from that decade, that era. So this is a product of the 2010s in that sense. The raw materials were from that time, because the thing is that the situation has changed. And unfortunately, I would have to say, at least in Northeast China and probably in many parts of China, the situation today is even worse than the situation in the 2010s. But it also depends on which location, which locality, which part of China. So the thing is that when I started this research, so in 2012, so the thing is that the PRC, so there are a lot of exciting new books on the 1950s were coming out. So there are lots of books that use these local archives and also these garbage sources in China. And then, but there were not many about Northeast China, Dongbei, which was very important in the Chinese industry in the 1950s and 60s. So I thought maybe I can add a new layer to this historiography by doing more local level archival research in Dongbei, especially in Angan. But then I realized that the archives in Northeast China was really more closed than places like Shanghai Municipal Archives or Beijing Municipal Archives. So the thing is that when I started reading these books, I was a little bit frustrated. I was thinking, why all these books, so many books, were about Shanghai and Beijing, and there were not so many within in other localities. But now, looking back now, I think there are reasons, legitimate reasons, because archives in some places in China are more open than others. But then the Northeast China, the Dongbei, the situation in archives are even worse than most other parts of China. So it's very hard to find some archival documents especially from the post-1949 period. But then I realized that still it's important to continue the research. And then this eventually led me to do research more in outside China. So there were these important some Chinese documents, the unpublished Chinese documents available in Hong Kong, where you guys are. And also because my research relates to the pre-1949 period, there were archives of the nationalist China in Taiwan. Now most of them are available online. And then I also found out that there were these Japanese engineers who stayed in Angan and Manchuria. So after 1949, so they stayed until about 1953. And then when I started the research, so after the Japanese Foreign Ministry archives made some new sources available. I think it's interview records of these Japanese engineers who worked for the Communist Party in Angan and other parts of Manchuria. So the thing is that these Japanese people worked there and they went back to Japan in 1953 and 54. But then when they came back to Japan, the thing is that their experience was so special because at the time, nobody could go to China. So the Japanese intelligence agency wanted to know more about what's going on in China, and they got some funding from the CIA, and they interviewed these people. And then they made some interview records, and which are now available in the Foreign Ministry archives. And now I think last year or 2 years ago, I think the Japanese Foreign Ministry archives made them even available online. Yeah, so there are these sources. And also, another difference between today and 10 years ago was that when I was doing research in the mid-2010s, I could go to Russia to research. So I went to Moscow to work on these documents about Angan, because the Soviet Union, they first occupied Angan in 1945 and 46, and then it provided a huge amount of economic assistance or cooperation to the enterprise in the 1950s, especially during China's first 5-year plan. So there are several archives in Moscow that hold documents related to Angan. Especially the most important one was the Russian State Economic Archives. And there I found out like some dozens of boxes about Angan from the collection of the Soviet Ministry of Metallurgy Industry. So yeah, so there are some other archives available in the United States. So there are all these and also at that time I could buy some stuff like from the online bookstore in China, which I assume are more difficult today, but it was not that hard at that time. So basically, I use all these archives and libraries and obscure sources from everywhere except for Angan itself. So yeah, that is the situation of my sources. Oh, by the way, add one thing. The thing is that I always complain about archives. That said, I found out Angan and also the city of Anshan, like many other these governments, the local governments and state enterprises in China, did publish a lot of collected documents and also their own company histories or local histories. So in case of Angan and also each factory published their own company histories, and Anshan city, their government, also each government division, like the Department of Urban Construction or whatever, published their own history, and they are really interesting, and they just contain a lot of important information that I didn't expect. So I think that very often, like people assume that they're just, piece of propaganda. Well, yes, I mean they are censored to a certain extent, but still, if you read these published documents carefully, they do include way more important information that you would assume.
Yeah, that's very useful, I think, and very interesting to hear. Yeah, like your experience in collecting sources, and particularly the importance of using international sources outside of mainland China, I think, is also important. Okay, so I think the next question by Li Lin is actually, you already answered that, because that person also asks about collecting sources from archives. The question thereafter is from Li Yuan, also asks about sources, but also asks, I wonder if there are any other similar enterprises like Angang representing socialist industrialization. I'm sure there must be, but whether you want to comment on that.
Yep. Thank you so much. It's a very important question that I often ask myself while doing the research. And my answer is answer was unique and common in different ways. So the thing is that, another thing is that to some extent, Angan's experience, originating from the Japanese period, was really basically common to many, if not all, most of the major enterprises in Dongbei. But you cannot say the same things about enterprises in, say, Shanghai. Well, some of them were built by the Japanese private, enterprises during the interwar period, but most of them were very Chinese capitals. So the thing is that, as I said, it's very hard. Then it's hard to say which company is more common than others, because the thing is that each company and actually each region in China had really different historical paths until 1949. So they are different. So I'm not saying Angan was the representative enterprise of China as a whole, although it does have common themes in some ways. But I would always try to present Angan as the representative enterprise of Manchuria, Dongbei. having said that, there is also important differences between these major enterprises in Manchuria as well. So, for instance, Victor Saw wrote a book about the fusion in Manchuria, which is another important, some Japanese, formerly Japanese enterprise in Manchuria. That said, fusion was, at the initial stage, it was originally developed by the Russians. And Angan does not have that part of history. So fusion was first built by the Russians, then taken over by the Japanese, the nationalists, and then the Communist Party. But Angan really began with the Japanese, as a Japanese enterprise. But there are still other enterprises in Northeast China, like the Ichi, the first factory. So the largest automaking enterprise built in the 1950s, and they didn't exist in Manchukuo. They were really built from scratch in the 1950s with the Soviet assistance. But then there is still another category, which is some enterprise like Daqin, which Holly Roshi wrote about. So I think that Daqin was really created with some China's own efforts, and there was not really a Soviet involvement. So even within Manchuria, so there were some slight more important differences among these enterprises. So what I try to do in my book is I just don't want to present Angan as, I don't want to present it either as a completely unique or completely representative. I think, I will try to show what was some more common about the history and what was more unique about Angan. And that is why, if you read my book, you will see there's some frequent references to not just about Angan, but it's also about Manchuria in general and also China in general, sometimes East Asia. I did it to show the difference and commonalities between Angan and other enterprises.
Yeah, thank you. The next question comes from Katrina Schwendener, and she asks, I'm wondering if there's any particular reason why Mao never went to Angan. I did my research in Ma'anshan in Anhui, which has a steel SOE that seems to have a similar history. Based on early Japanese industrialization, the communists established a mid-sized integrated steel enterprise there. Mao visited twice in the 1950s. I guess I'm curious why he wouldn't visit a place like Angan that seems to be such a core enterprise.
Yes, thank you so much. That's a really important question that I was always curious to know the answer, but I haven't found one. But it's very interesting. So when I go to Angan, so people there are very proud of their history in the 1950s and saying, okay, how important Chairman Mao think Angan was. But then some of them say, okay, but there is some one thing that we really just Yihan, which is Chairman Mao has never visited Angan. And it is really interesting for me. I don't know why, but somehow that is what it is. So Chairman Mao has never visited it, even though he always wrote about Angan, in his memo or in some report, and he talks about Angan. Yeah, but then, as I showed, they brought all these foreign some leaders to Angan, like Neo, I think Kim Il-sung and other these leaders. And then some people Choi and Deng Xiaoping visited Angan, but somehow Chairman Mao has never visited Angan. Yep, although he did visit Fushun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then people really didn't like to hear that when I said that, so I just stopped mentioning the fact that Mao visited Fushun in front of people of Angan. So but I don't know why somehow visited it. It's a huge mystery to me even to date.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah, thank you. The next question comes from Sean James, and he asks, you mentioned the commonality of late industrializing countries focusing on state-centered investment and economic planning, and how this was continuous from before 1949 and after. You also linked this to the academic challenge regarding 1949 as a watershed date. Do you think that the relative success of Chinese industrialization could have occurred under the KMT and capitalism? Or would you say that the expropriation of capitalist private property, state planning, and Soviet aid were essential to Chinese economic development and distinguished it from other late industrializing countries like Brazil, India, etc., and that 1949 to 56 was indeed a watershed in Chinese and global history?
Yes, thank you so much. That's a huge question. Yeah, I mean, whether the Chinese injustice would have happened under KMT, and I would say mostly yes. It should have happened in another form. But, the thing is, the problem is that, it never happened, as we said, because the KMT, was lost, to the CCP in 1949, well, actually in 1948 in Manchuria. But then, interesting is that this change and continuity and also this KMT did happen in Taiwan. And then obviously there were these some KMT, wartime technocrats, these engineers or bureaucrats who were engaged in this some economic mobilization in places like Sichuan during the war, and then who were later moved to Taiwan after the Japanese Empire collapsed. And then until some for several decades, so they did play a central role in the KMT's economic some policies in Taiwan. And then obviously Taiwan industrialized even faster after World War II. So yeah, you could say that something should have happened in Manchuria if the KMT had not lost. Yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah, but interesting is there are always some continuity. So the KMT engaged in this economic mobilization during the war with Japan in the Dahofang in Sichuan. But then after World War II, they sent. So when the war ended with the Japanese surrender, so the KMT took over Manchuria, in Manchuria, and also Taiwan, and also Shanghai. And in many cases, these engineers, scientists, and managers who worked in the wartime Sichuan were sent to these formerly Japanese-occupied places. And then there were movements of people who moved from wartime Sichuan to Manchuria and wartime Sichuan to Taiwan or Shanghai. But in case of these people, KMT people, many of them who were initially sent to Manchuria, well, some of them stayed there, but many of them also ended up in Taiwan. So yeah, I mean, so the thing is that for something this should have happened, but it's not really the more kind of a market-oriented capitalist system, because the KMT at the time was, they did not deny the market economy as a system as a whole, but they were really kind of geared towards a stronger state coordination. So yeah, so something should have happened if KMT hadn't lost, but we don't know.
Right, yeah, no, thank you. It's always difficult to talk about these kind of counterfactuals. I
mean, if you're, the thing is, economists and social science also always talk about this counterfactual question, but kind of we historians often just hesitate to say that.
Well, thank you. The next question, I think we can probably, we still have a bit of time. The next question comes from Hubolin. And the question is, thank you so much for sharing. I was wondering if you have made some comparison during your research to another example of PRC China's industrialization, and that is Wugang in Wuhan. Because Wuhan was somewhat one of Mao's favorite places to try China's industrialization, and it was also partly sponsored.
Yep. Thank you. So Wugang was also developed in the first 5-year plan. It's kind of also with the Soviet some technology. So the thing is that there is both similarity and difference, and also the connections. The thing is that Wugan, as far as I know, they were not really built up. They are more or less built from scratch during the first 5-year plan. So yeah, that is a huge difference. But both Wugan and Angan, made use of the Soviet technology in the 1950s. And then interesting is that there is a huge connection between Ugan, actually, between Angan and other steel enterprises in different parts of China. So Angan was called the Gonghuo Chanzi, so the first son of the Republic. So basically, it was the first and the largest steel enterprise. But then, obviously, if you're Chairman Mao, you cannot have a huge enterprise only in Manchuria. You have to make them in different parts, like in Wuhan, or like, Baotou, or in these places. When they build these places, these steel enterprises in different places, so they often use the experience of Angan, like they send these Angan engineers, managers, cadres to these places. And also they send these workers and technicians from these places to intern in Angan. So there were these Angan cadres. So the thing is that, there's technicians. So the thing is, it's interesting. So about Angan, so there's another steel enterprise in Baotou built during the 1950s, and I was talking with someone from Baotou. They said there is a corner of Baotou where people speak Dongbei dialect because there are these families of these Angan engineers who were sent there, in the mid-1950s. So yes, there is a huge continuity, and basically, so Angan's experience was shared to other state enterprises in China, and even later on, there was the third front construction in the late 1960s, and then you can read Kobe Maeskin's book on the topic, and then there was this Angan engine. Actually, a whole factory of Angan was moved from Anshan to some place which place I forgot, in the inland region. And when China constructed the some Baoshan steel enterprise in the 1980s, lots of these leaders of the new enterprise in Shanghai actually came from Anshan. So Angan really provided these some talent to these new steel enterprises. So yes, there is commonalities between these enterprises because very often they are same people running these enterprises.
Yeah, thank you. We have one more question from, let's do one more question from one of our students, actually, Zhang Yunfei. And Yunfei asks, thanks for your wonderful talk. I really look forward to reading your book. My question is that in recent years, we have witnessed an increasing number of studies focusing on the borderlands of modern China, especially Manchuria, including your study, as well as Victor Hsu's study of Fushun and Holi's study of Daqing, etc. And I would like to know if you think that this is a new trend of discovering history in China's global frontiers, or whether these recent studies, or whether there's anything else these recent studies have in common.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I think, yes, I agree that there's some more and more attention to these border ones. Oh, one thing is that it's very important because it's not, again, so I live in Shanghai basically in this year, but Shanghai is not China. It's a very different place. We can't just study Shanghai or Beijing and say it's the whole China. Thing is that these border ones are important. Well, it also some connects to some Gaston's book about these bunkers, forming bunkers in China. Because border ones or frontiers were the places where these connections with these transnational or global forces often took place. In the case of Manchuria, well, it was obviously bordered with Russia or Japan, and also another factor that I didn't really discuss in my book is Korea. So all these different forces, societies, just their influences came to China via these border ones. And the Manchuria is very Angan is very typical. It was first built by the Japanese, but then Manchuria and Angan did become the hub of China's learning of the Soviet technology in the late 1940s and 1950s. And then there are also in another way, of course, there's another way to look at the border ones, the frontiers. You can say you do look at these minority peoples, which are very important. Having said that, it's harder. Sometimes it's not easy to do research about these border ones compared to places like Beijing or Shanghai. So, yes, it makes sense for scholars to pay more attention to these China's peripheries or border ones or frontiers, whatever you call it. And that's but it is harder to do research within these border ones because very often they are more kind of like, some politically strict, and they are often more like, some restriction on archives or research compared to places like, some Beijing or Shanghai Municipal Archives.
Yeah, thank you. We're pretty much out of time, but I think one last question would be a nice way to end it, and that comes from Professor Maurice Bien. And Professor Bien asks or says, "Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Dr. Hirata." And he asks, and he looks forward to reading your book, but he asks, "Can you talk a little bit about your current project?" And I think that would be a good way to I think conclude the talk. So I think if you could talk a bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Maurice, for coming to my work. So your book and your actually other articles were some major source of inspiration for my own work. And as you see, like your works are cited extensively in my book. So yes, my current project, thank you, is like, so obviously that is why I am in Shanghai. I am now currently working on the foreign trade of Maoya China. So the thing is that, so my idea is that I want to see how these economic connection with other countries, like some made the China's planned economy work during the Mao period. So I am doing research in Shanghai Municipal Archives and also in other archives like the Beijing Municipal Archives. And also because so in Maoya China, so the largest trading partner in the 1950s was the Soviet Union. And then my original plan was to do research in Russia. So that is what I had in mind when I wrote I was writing some, application for research projects like several years ago, but then obviously it's not going to happen this year or next year. So yeah, but then I can still access some Russian materials from some various places in China and also from my own previous research, and also there are published sources from Russia. And also in the late Mao period, China's the largest trading partner was Japan. So I can do research in Japan. So I'm frequently visiting Tokyo to do research in the Foreign Ministry archives and other archives, and probably in the early next spring I'm going to some obscure place to work on some private archives of Japanese business people with the collections in China. So I'm still doing research. So the thing is that this is more, it's not really based on one company. It's more about, China's foreign trade as a whole, but it is organically connected with my ongoing work in the sense that I'm trying to see how China's planned economy was connected in, other parts of the world economically. Yep. Thank you so much for asking the question.
Yeah.
Also, I'm looking forward to reading your next book, Maurice. Thank you.
I think we all are, yeah. Thank you, Koji, first of all. And what remains for me to do, we are already over time, so what remains for me to do is to thank you very much, Koji, for taking the time to talk to us about your book. Congratulations again on the publication. Again, I think we should all now go and actually get a copy and read it. Thank you also for everyone who tuned in to this talk. We'll be back next semester, yes, with a new lineup of talks in the Chinese Business History webinar series. So please have a look at that. But thank you to everyone, and thank you in particular to Dr. Hirata. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.
All right, I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.